Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitics survey created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things Policy podcast. This is Avinash Sheth, research analyst at the Takshashila Institution. And I have with me my fellow colleague, Shobhankita. And in this episode of All Things Policy, we are going to discuss about the software DeepTech startups and we'll touch upon the idea of patenting a software. Welcome, Shobhankita.
Thank you, Avinash.
So, even though I want to talk to you about the software DeepTech, but I would like to start with even more simpler question, right? I want to ask you about what do you think a deep tech startup is? How do you classify a startup as deep tech? You know, uh, so if you can tell me more about it, to build up that foundation for this whole talk.
Yeah. This goes back to a discussion I was having with a friend 2 years ago. And he told me, don't talk to me in Silicon Valley speak. What even is deep tech? Like, tell me, what are you talking about even, right? So why jargon that people don't understand? But I think this might be one of those words that's now come into the popular mainstream. As you may know, there is a national deep tech startup policy. So obviously, this is, very, very popular mainstream as a word at this point. But really, I would say this is a word that came into the popular consciousness only about 10-15 years ago. Obviously, what today we qualify and consider deep tech has been around for hundreds of years since the development of research and technological innovations. But really, the idea of deep tech and the deep tech startup, I would say, is quite new, not more than 15 years old, right? So I would say there are a few ways you can think about what makes a startup deep tech. I think first is that it's founded in research and just a lot of research work, right? Like cutting edge pioneering work that's pushing the boundaries of what the state of the ecosystem currently are. These also typically tend to be in sectors and fields that are novel for that period. It is also very contextual as a word, right? So, what is going to be deep tech today might not be deep tech tomorrow. What is deep tech in one sector might not be necessarily deep tech in another sector. So it's very contextual and it's also, very geographical, which is to say that in some ecosystems where, just the level of research work and innovation in technology are higher than others, the level of deep tech and the bar for that deep tech is going to be different than in other ecosystems. To maybe use some heuristics here, the likes of quantum computing, space technologies, cutting edge artificial intelligence infrastructure, data infrastructure, right? So I think some of these could be considered deep tech. There are other sectors, for example, industrial manufacturing, industrial robotics, biotechnology, life sciences, pharma, right? There is so much innovation happening in each of these sectors that contextually for these sectors, there should be, going into the technology innovation happening there. What is the state of the ecosystem at that point in time? What is the level of work that these particular set of founders for that startup are working on? I would say those would be the filters typically for me to qualify something as deep tech versus not. But broadly speaking, a deep tech startup is not operation and execution oriented, in the sense that the most difficult thing to be figured out for the startup is not really the business model.
Right.
It's not really how to get a few operational logistics off the ground. It's not about just execution, right? I mean, it has to be led by technological research and innovation that's going to be or in the process of being commercialized. So I would say that is a good metric to have. And some deep tech startups have different ways of just their journeys, right? Which is to say that, for example, most SaaS startups or fintech startups or consumer startups typically tend to have linear growth with their timelines.
Right.
But the problem with deep tech and a feature in deep tech is that they have longer gestation periods, which is to say that for a long time, they pretty much don't have any revenue because the product is working. It's a working prototype. It's still in the works. And once it does go to market, we then have just revenue coming in at very, very high margins, because to begin with, that kind of research work, the kind of timelines it took to get that research to commercialization was large and long. And even the market risk for a deep tech startup is lower than that of other kinds of startups, right? Which is to say that the customer need for some of these problems is so large that the companies that are solving these will never run out of companies and customers to service. But their journey to being able to commercialize that product is where the difficulty really is. So I would say, lower market risk, longer gestation cycles, a need for more patient capital in the early days, a lot of research, collaboration, infrastructure, and resource sharing, just as a platform available in the early days, a lot of funding, including grants, etc., to be able to pursue this. Most of these founders also tend to be very technical folks. So they struggle with exactly understanding what customers want. So, there is a little bit of, I have this great technological problem that I'm solving, but I don't know what the business use case for this would be. So I think those are specifically the kinds of things that deep tech startups, I mean, of course, we have to contextualize this to the specific sector we're talking about. But broadly, I would say these are like a macro context, what a deep tech startup would go through.
That's nice. I mean, even though the question was only on deep tech, but you have summarized the whole deep tech startup ecosystem. That's so nice. Thanks a lot. And to our audience, I would like to say we have a whole dedicated podcast on this, and the link we'll be sharing in the description. And so let's come to the very specific deep tech startups we are looking into, right? I mean, which I only got to know while I was having a chat with you a couple of days back, where you talked about software deep tech, right? Deep tech startups. Frankly, I don't know. I mean, I always used to think any software, startup would be more of a tech startup, because I don't know in India particularly we have any startups who are working on building something cutting edge with respect to softwares, right? I mean, so when I even envision a deep tech startup, I can think of Google, right? Or I can think of OpenAI, the disruptive work these startups have been doing. So in terms of, what really you think, when you see in this startup ecosystem would consist of these deep tech startups? I mean, I'm very curious to know about it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, call it what you want, right? You can call it advanced software, advanced computing, you can have it whatever name you want. But really, I think the concept of a deep tech software really does make me want to talk about Google a little bit. At the time that it started, it really was a PhD research project by two geeks working in Stanford, right? So it is, for that time, contextual to the state of the ecosystem at that time. It is a very deep tech project. Today, of course, we forget that. We only consider Google as a big tech company. But really, anything that has a foundation in research work, that takes some time to come to fruition, that is pushing the limits of what our knowledge about something today as a whole community really is, I think that would be considered deep tech, right? So when it comes to software, like I was saying, quantum cryptography, that's definitely one field where there's a lot of work happening, and there is still a lot of scope for us to understand and push the limits there. AI infrastructure, I would say, correct? Because these are really complex things to build. Sure, I mean, you need the hardware to build that, you need the expertise to build that. But these are also complex things that we have not yet figured out what the best efficient way to go about it is. So I would say there are all of these different ways of thinking about the complexity of the technology involved, the expertise of the founders required to be able to piece together something like that, the kind of algorithms or complexities they need to go through to be able to solve that problem and to make it efficient in terms of cost to the final consumer. And also the fact that is this, and going back to the startup ecosystem lingo, which is it a fat product or a thin product, which is
Mm-hmm.
to say that is it just cobbling together a bunch of already available tools together in a
Mm.
way that's not really adding too much additional value back to the ecosystem, right? So I would consider
Correct.
that to typically be a thin product, and
Okay.
hence not a deep tech product. A
Mm-hmm.
deep tech product, software or otherwise, should be pushing our barriers in terms of what we know about that particular domain, sector, or our knowledge resources in that sector.
Okay. So I mean, what you have mentioned about this quantum cryptography and even the AI infrastructure. So what I can understand with that is where the software has very close linkage with the very evolving hardware, right? I mean, uh, or I don't know. I mean, quantum cryptography might also include a lot of algorithms to complement that kind of startups. Interesting. So that's something. Okay. So gives a good insights on where the software is heading in terms of as a technology, right? So this question comes in now that we understand, or we had talked about software deep tech startups, right? But then now that anytime it could be anyone, it could be government, it could be incubators, accelerators, whoever consider themselves as a supporter of a deep tech startup ecosystem and would like to support deep techs. So whenever these entities do look into these startups, they always, I mean, there are multiple parameters to look into. As one parameter you mentioned was the founders. What kind of research they have been doing, or what product they're making, and what kind of research it takes into. So there are all various different parameters. So and one of them is surely is the intellectual property, right? Because if you're making something new, making something disruptive, there's a very good chance you must be having an IP. So with respect to software itself, we understand that in India we don't patent a software. So how do these deep tech software startups would look into, like, how would we even look to measure these deep tech to even say they are deep tech or they can be a deep tech? So, and that is something I would like to know more from you, and maybe I think we have to do a lot of discussion onto that as well.
Yeah. So, coming to your point on intellectual property, right? This is something that I'm very hesitant about. I have very mixed views about this, as you're aware. And I think, yes, I mean, one way to look at it is that software is essentially a combination of countless methods, techniques, mathematics, and logic. And if that is the case, that it's by definition put together through countless techniques, is there any merit to patenting it particularly? Correct.
Mm.
And so, if there is no merit to patenting it particularly, then is that necessarily a parameter to qualify and classify something as deep tech software versus not? Is that
Mm-hmm.
a necessary condition? I
Okay.
would want to talk about my opinion, which is that I don't think it should be. And
Okay.
I think patents per se have been really mixed in terms of what they've achieved, right? So let's talk about just broadly the patent ecosystem, right? So I will talk about two examples particularly, which is
Mhm.
one of IBM, which really, depending on how you look at it, you can think of it as a massive patent roll, which is that in the years of its prime, this is about 2016, 2017, and IBM was getting about $1 billion purely from licensing of its patents. And these
Okay.
were, pretty basic stuff, right? Like IBM had essentially built a portfolio of patents through the products and platforms that they were working on, which might have been cutting edge for the time or very incremental to the knowledge base at that point in time, but they went ahead and patented it. And, they have been reaping the benefits of that ecosystem for a very long time now. For example, in the years 2022 and 2023, respectively, IBM's annual reports say that about 300, 400 million respectively came purely from their patent portfolio as licensing fees. And IBM is also highly willing to litigate this. So it's essentially them against much smaller players, or pretty much everybody else. Every other company, tech company globally, has been paying IBM for some of these licensing costs. So at one point in time, their website said that they had about 250,000 experts to help you find the right patents for your company, correct? And if you think about ThinkPad, which they eventually went on to sell to Lenovo, they had acquired a bunch of patents around that before selling the entire product line itself. So it does seem like, to some extent, IBM's strategy was, building up the patent portfolio and then deciding to kind of litigate and take people to court. And these were all around analytics, big data, what they would call cognitive computing at the time. So these were all essentially software patents, right? And some software patents can really be absurd. And we were talking about this prior, but Amazon at one point in time had a one-click shopping patent, which is to say that to check out, if you have to do a single click confirmation, that was patented, right? And Apple even today has a patent to the slide to unlock feature, which is the UI. With the rounded buttons and the corners of the button and stuff, right? So I mean, it's just a UI. Do you really need a patent for that? And what are you really looking to save? So it does seem like we have lost the plot in some sense, which is that I'm not saying patents don't have any value at all. They absolutely do. But at one point in time, I would assume to think that they came about to protect smaller players and individual contributors and scientists from other people exploiting their research work, right? So it was a protection measure for the smaller players, but that's not how patents have turned out to be. This is really the big companies litigating, and it usually works against smaller companies and smaller players, right? So I would say that's where I'm a little hesitant about the larger story of software patents. The second example I want to talk about is the field of biotechnology, which is that biotechnology is one of those sectors where we have very clear milestones to be able to commercialize a drug molecule eventually to the end consumer, right? So there is a clear process of FDA approval processes and so on. So multiple innovations might go into the research work as these processes go on in the back end, and then you have a breakthrough, which is your final drug. So you want to be able to protect these multiple innovations so as not to be able to to still have some commercializing capability over the final drug. And the patents also help the people who have worked on this research work for a long period of time to be essentially saving themselves from generics, correct? Because somebody can then just without having done the work sell the same drug. So it kind of helps them. But if you look at how pharmaceutical industry has really been exploiting these laws, for example, there is a drug called Humira, and I'm all for patents and for patenting novel technology, but this one drug alone has about 150 plus patents granted to it. And the last of these patents expires in 2037. That's a long time ago. Right? So to chase some of these risks of generics away, every small change is being patented. Right? So it can be as simple as the dosage of the drug. It can be as simple as small changes in the clinical trial process. So honestly, what's happening is patents are being used to stifle innovation versus their original purpose, which was to encourage innovation and to encourage people to have an incentive to be working on their research work for many years without necessarily seeing the commercial, money out of that. So really, there are negative consequences to patents. And when it comes to software, particularly, the reason I have these reservations is that it's just like music, right? In some sense, which is that all music is made from fundamentally 7 notes. Correct. I mean, there are very few building blocks from which you end up creating all the music that we ever hear. And so music, to the most part, cannot be patented. We have trademarks, we have copyright law, to protect the creators of the music, which, by the way, is also applicable to software today. You can also have trade secrets that protect software. You also have copyright around software. So, why increase and encourage monopolizing software in any regard, right? And
Yeah.
honestly, this has been the view even in India. So, as per the Patents Act, computer programs per se are not patentable. But what's been happening in the last few years is every year about 1,000 software patent applications are being filed, and about hundreds of them are getting approved. So,
Okay.
even though we don't necessarily have a litigation first environment, which is that if you do me wrong, I'm less likely, or my first instinct is not to go to the courts, right? I mean, we understand that it's going to be a long process, and that itself kind of not necessarily drags people to courts.
Correct.
So we are not a litigation first economy. And so what that means is, by definition, the smaller players are not going to be bothered with going to court. And so again, when you encourage an environment of software patenting by which potentially you could have software litigation, the only people that are going to be benefiting from this are large companies that can afford these legal fees. Correct? And so these are really, really high legal fees, right? I mean, at the minimum, it's going to be 60 lakh. And this is referring to some work that FOSS United has done, which is to say, if you do get slapped by any kind of patent infringement court order, then what kind of fees and what kind of timelines? And they say anywhere between 60 lakhs to a couple crores and a minimum of few years, running around to get this solved, whether or not you decide to settle or go to trial. So what really are we achieving? And the reason I think this entire conversation is very valid right now is because the National Deep Tech Startup Policy also includes multiple applications and software startups to be in this list, which is artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, augmented reality, virtual reality, things like that. And the deep tech startup policy has multiple great ideas, right? And we can discuss this a little more in detail. But, you know, one thing that really struck out to me is that they talk about encouraging an open and knowledge sharing collaboration environment. And at the same time, they talk about just making better and bolstering the intellectual property regime in India. So they seem to be contradictory to me. And I feel like if we end up actually going through with software patents being a real possibility, according to what this policy seems to, be kind of flirting with. I think, we're going to be inviting some of these cases that we've seen in the US to India as well, which so far we have not seen, but it's going to be at the detriment of smaller players and individual developers.
Okay. So the whole idea now you're just saying there are such unintended consequences for this patent itself, right? I mean, that's crazy to hear how big players are making use of this concept and to get that leverage over the small players. And in that way, I think patent might lose or is unable to do what it's supposed to do. That's interesting. So yeah, I'm even the example you really talked about, right? I mean, about the musical notes and how you don't patent musical notes because then you won't be able to make those musics, and then so there is no point of really patenting such basic foundational stuff and all, like algorithms, or because then you cannot build something very complex or meaningful at the end, which might be comprising of those things, right? Interesting. I mean, I'm really fascinated by even the money aspect. And I think, yes, I think it's interesting to note how in National Deep Tech Startup Policy, there are two different ends where both free and open source software has been promoted, but then at the same time, to protect so called deep tech inventions or so, it also promotes software patenting, right? And it would be interesting to see how this would be tackled in the upcoming drafts of the policy. Um, so, now that you did touched upon um, the negative aspects, of patenting a software, right? And we do have these technologies or software deep tech startups who are upcoming and who are working on serious problems to solve these serious problems. So, if patent is not the option, then what do you think that what are the parameters to look for, even to recognize these software deep tech startups, of course, for different reasons, right? It could be in terms of building policy for them, or helping out them in terms of funding. And so, because the problem with any deep tech startup faces, I'm assuming the software deep tech startups will also say face the same. So, what do you think? If patent is even out of the talk for this, what? How can we even recognize a deep tech startup, deep tech software deep tech startup?
So the policy actually has a very interesting sort of an attempt to talk about a deep tech startup in a service and software environment, right?
Okay.
And they define that as a software startup with the expressed objective of providing technology solutions requiring R&D greater than 1 year and
Okay.
rupees 1 crore capex, which is non-R&D investment before commercialization, and which has potential for impacting the economy with an IRR of greater than 30%.
Okay.
So this is, to me, sounds very vague. It doesn't
Correct.
really help me
Yeah.
in any way. But just wanted to say that the policy does try to put down some numbers to what might constitute to be a deep tech software startup. I would say, look, it's really contextual, right? I would say what do you want to do to ensure that these startups thrive? And I don't think that's going to be very different from other kinds of deep tech startups anyway. So that would be they would need infrastructure support, they would
Hmm.
need compute support, they
Correct.
would need access to resources, high quality talent, they would need funding. Especially because they would not be able to see customer money flowing in early enough. So they
Correct.
would need this funding for a sufficiently longer period of time. They would want patient capital. So, I mean, all of these are true for all kinds of deep tech startups, software or not.
Hmm.
And so I would say, depending on the specific thing being solved for, depending on the research work that's looking to be commercialized, depending on the kind of complexity in the product that the founders are looking to build, there are other ways to de risk this, right? For
Okay.
example, one would be with a design partner in place. Is it possible that your enterprise software product can be built with the help of a design partner? And that design partner kind of really helps you with intent and time to finally get together the final product piece before you can take it to customers, because at least the product that is being built is iteratively in the right direction. I would say the other is all of these infrastructure and resource sharing support that they need, to have institutions to help that for companies that need that. So I feel like while we can have definitions that are very specific to the state of the ecosystem at that point in time, going into the technical complexity, the execution, the architecture, the software architecture that's being deployed, I would say, is it really that helpful to be able to and to need to qualify something as deep tech software when these are the help they need and this is what the ecosystem needs to provide, right? So I am exactly talking about if there's a word that is still being understood and in the specific context, why jump to a lazy answer, which is anything with patents? The
Okay.
answer is not that simple, clearly. It lies in multiple nuanced things across different ways the startup is operating. Maybe we should look at some of those.
The characteristic of the problems what deep tech startup faces, right? I mean, if they are matching with these few parameters like high gestation period, high initial cost, capital cost, infrastructure, very complex infrastructure needed because they are trying to get into this outright, disruptive space, right? I mean, it's something might not, it's something you have to do it very newly as well, right? Interesting. So that's an interesting thing. I mean, you also did mention about the fat nature of the product, and you know, um, I think yes. So this dialogue, I hope this dialogue, what we had, presents an opportunity to tackle a lot of interesting policy aspects, with respect to software patents, with respect to deep tech startup ecosystem itself, which includes the software deep tech startups, and hope our thoughts on these, reach to right audience and all the audience, I would say. And thanks a lot, Shubhankita, for joining me for this podcast. Any last comments you would like to have?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe for another time, but I would definitely want to rethink about the patent regime we have overall, right? I mean, it seems to me that in the world of hardware, we have really accepted the idea of patents. when again, the same things that I talked about, how they are being misused by big tech companies and larger corporations, and it's to the detriment of the overall innovation, knowledge sharing happening across the ecosystem. It affects smaller players. All of this is true, especially in hardware as well, right? For example, the Takshashila's open tech strategy document actually talks about how the price of consumer electronics would just drastically go down if many of the PDK files, as well as some of these designs, were all open access. Right? So I think that's a larger discussion to be had for another day. I really worry that the idea of patents is a very lazy and simple one. I honestly feel the incentives for some of these patents are really lopsided. It ties almost into the publish and perish culture of academia, right? Like patents are a way of signaling that you hoard patents, hopefully because tomorrow you can license them. So it's really not helping the overall ecosystem as a whole. So I think we leave it to our audience at this point in time to think through what that might even mean for the larger ecosystem. I think we need to question just what we have accepted to be true for other kinds of applications. Yeah, I mean, I think
Correct. I mean, it's not just the India problem, it's the global problem on the whole concept of patent and how we can really reform it to what it really is supposed to be doing. That's great. Yeah.
So many of these patents, when they're filed, are actually purposefully left very broad and vague. Because they want to be potentially able to claim, even when they had not necessarily disclosed any strategy or any specific steps towards what they're filing for. So that kind of leaves them with a broader net when they want to chase somebody that might have potentially infringed on that. So there are other kinds of problems with this entire regime also.
Maybe yes. With the next podcast, we can totally talk about this. So thank you, Shobhankita, for joining me in this podcast.
Thank you. Thank you,
everyone.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.